FanScape, a fan fiction podcast, presents Blood and Venom Part 2, Shattered Reality. Chapter 7, Breathing Room.
Lauren jolted awake in a cold sweat, breathing heavily as memories of what she wished was only a nightmare clouded her mind. She sat there for a few minutes and tried to compose herself, doing her best to ignore her aching headache and the lingering pain from the chaser's brutal assault. Her injuries weren't nearly as bad as they could have been, mainly due to the intervention of the faceless demon, but Lauren wasn't about to thank him for anything, even if he was the only reason that she was still alive. She hated him more than words could describe, especially after seeing what he'd done to a helpless, innocent child. The suited man had pretended to be Charlie's friend for months, only to murder him in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. And for what? For amusement? For sport? It was sickening, and Lauren would have killed the monster for it in an instant if given the opportunity.
But I did try to kill it, and that thing didn't die,
Lauren thought. It was a strange feeling, being so willing to kill, when only a week ago she'd been reluctant to hold a weapon, let alone use one on something. The horrors she'd been through, the things she'd learned, they'd changed her, and not entirely for the better.
Why did he even show me that? Was it a scare tactic or something?
She muttered, staggering to her feet. After making sure her equipment was still working, she shined her flashlight around the cold, dark room, discovering that it was much larger than she'd initially thought. The walls, floor, and ceiling were made from the same material as the rest of the mine, and its layout was reminiscent of a giant square. Embedded in the walls were various elevator shafts, corresponding to other sections of the mine, confirming the theory that she'd had about them. And directly ahead was a rectangular hallway that branched off from the room and went straight forward. Having no desire to explore more of the Coleman mine, Lauren limped away from the lifts and made her way down the hall, wincing with every step. Several pallets and wooden crates were littering the area, something that struck her as odd since this was supposed to be an evacuation route and nothing more. Eventually, she reached a point where the hall took a sharp turn to the left, and a smile spread across her face as she spotted the bright afternoon sunlight just ahead. Ignoring her injuries, she sprinted towards the wide-open exit as the sound of birds chirping and wind blowing through the trees filled her ears. She took a deep breath of fresh air as she burst out of the dark tunnel and onto the grassy ridge ahead, happily taking in the refreshing smell of the forest instead of the stale, stuffy air of the old mine. Squinting in the bright sunlight, Lauren turned her flashlight off and took her first real look around, discovering that she now stood high up on a mountain range. The mountains weren't tall enough to have snow on them at this time of the year, but it was still a bit colder than it had been on the ground far below. The uneven slopes of the ridge were covered in dark green grass and dotted with trees, but the landscape appeared to be easily traversable, much to Lauren's relief. She'd been through more than most and managed to come out of it in one piece, but she wasn't sure she had the energy left for rock climbing. Hiking, on the other hand, was something she could manage. She knew that she had to keep moving, but first she needed a breather. She could only push herself so far before collapsing, especially with her injuries, and Lauren was nearing her limit. The exhausted woman flopped down in the grass and closed her eyes, letting the sun warm her skin as she rested her aching body. It was peaceful on the ridge. There were no nasty surprises waiting in dark corners, no eldritch abominations lurking in the trees, and no crying zombies or masked psychopaths skulking nearby. It was nice to have some breathing room after the horrors she'd been forced to go through. But as much as she wanted to trust it, she didn't. The suited man had already shown her that she wasn't even safe in her own mind, so she had to be alert at all times now. Her body may have been relaxed, but her mind was far from it, especially with everything she'd witnessed after entering the Coleman mine. Even with the confirmation of Charlie being one of the suited man's victims, she still had to wonder why the Madsons were so prominent in everything. Sure, what had happened to the child was horrible, but what was it that made him so much more significant than all the demon's other victims? And how was his fate related to her own dilemma in any way? The Mathesons were clearly an important piece of this nightmarish puzzle, but she still didn't have enough information to understand why. Lauren found herself thinking back to the burnt house that had once belonged to Charlie's parents, remembering the crying ghouls she'd seen inside of it. After seeing how the suited man had controlled the chaser in the mines, she was beginning to wonder if the decaying creature was another one of the demon's slaves. If so, why didn't it attack her at first? If it had more control over itself, why was it so much more decayed than the chaser when the latter was completely feral? These were questions that she didn't have the answers for, but the initial theory made sense. She doubted that she would have ever encountered the thing if it wasn't connected to everything else that was going on. That was when a terrible thought went through her head. Maybe, just maybe, the thing she'd seen in the house was all that was left of Charlie Matheson Jr. Maybe he too had been broken and turned into a servant of the suited man, but had suffered far worse than the chaser for far longer. It would explain why the creature was lingering in that specific house, but not much else, so it was a bit of a stretch.
No, that can't be it.
Lauren told herself. It was bad enough for an innocent kid to die at the hands of a monster, and she couldn't bear the thought of him suffering something worse than that. As she opened her eyes and stared up at the clouds floating across the sky, she began to wonder about her own involvement in this haunting. Taking the latest developments into consideration, at first, she thought it was something as simple as getting caught in the crossfire of what was going on with Kate and Carl. But now, she was having second thoughts. The note left in her apartment was one thing, as were the silver bullets that she'd been given, and she could dismiss both as being unrelated to the bigger picture if she really wanted to. However, the suited man outright telling her that she was important enough to keep alive was something else entirely, especially when he said that she'd find out what he wanted with her soon enough. The question was, when would that be, and how long would he bother keeping her alive? The more she thought about it, the more she realized how little sense the things that she'd been through really made. She'd come to realize that her enemies had been several steps ahead of her the entire time, and yet they were still having a hard time bringing her down for some reason. After hunting her so relentlessly, why had the suited man let her go instead of capturing her when she couldn't move or fight back? Was it because he liked the thrill of the hunt? Did he have some semblance of respect for her? Lauren found the latter very unlikely. And even more unlikely was it being a coincidence that she'd heard Kate screaming at just the right time, from just the right distance away for her to hear it and come running to her aid, right into the enemy's grasp. She remembered the writing on the walls of the boat launch, the writing that had urged her to enter the park and find Kate, as well as the journal that was conveniently placed right under it. She'd known even then that her friend hadn't been responsible for it, but the more she thought about that carefully placed lure, the more she thought about the times that she'd seen the suited man lurking in the shadows before actually meeting him face to face, the more it all seemed a little too well structured and aimed at her for it to be something as simple as getting caught up in her friend's mess. Even the timing of all this happening on the exact date that she was supposed to visit Kate was suspicious. And she was starting to wonder if even her assignment with the Oakside case was the work of some higher power, some unseen, faceless puppet master pulling the strings. She wasn't sure about that last part, but everything else added up when she lumped it all together. And there was even more. She remembered what Firebrand, whose involvement made even less sense than anything else, had told her about the Collective. How they were the suited man's most terrible, most powerful servants. Why would they have ever been involved if she was just some random lady in the wrong place at the wrong time?
Speaking of Firebrand, what the hell is his deal?
Lauren wondered. She was smart enough to know that the grinning entity wasn't helping her out of the kindness of his heart alone. Still, he had helped her quite a bit, even if there was some ulterior motive. But if he really was her ally, then why did he make her go through the horrors of the Coleman mines instead of just taking her to where she was now? Or even to the radio tower? Was it to teach her some kind of lesson? Was it to show her that Kate and Carl had been there? Couldn't he have just told her that, instead of leaving her to fight through that underground nightmare alone? If he really was trying to help her, then why was he being so cryptic? Why hadn't she seen him since they'd first met? Why did he seem so familiar? And what was he? Even the actual challenges she'd faced seemed strange when she thought about them. Of all things, Why had she been made to look for torn notebook pages in a forest, like some sort of bizarre scavenger hunt? Why had the suited man been waiting to unleash the chaser at just the right moment? And for the millionth time, why had he saved her life and let her walk away after hunting her so mercilessly? None of it made any sense. Lauren was well aware that she was outmatched in every sense of the word. Her enemies could have killed or captured her at any moment. They could do that at this moment. And yet they hadn't done that. They weren't doing that. But why? What purpose did it serve to give her a fighting chance? It was almost like they were toying with her, playing with their food. But Lauren doubted the answer was as simple as that. Something much bigger than what she'd initially thought was going on. Something far beyond her understanding. And it was becoming increasingly clear that for whatever reason, she was at the center of it all. That sudden realization sent chills down her spine, and she sat up in the grass, more confused and paranoid now than she had been before. She took a few moments to collect her thoughts, catching a glimpse of the radio tower standing tall behind a rock formation. She was surprised to see how close it was now, and figured that if nothing else delayed her, she could probably reach it before sunset. A smile spread across her face as she realized how close she was to reuniting with her friends, and she immediately stood back up and resumed her journey.
I don't know what'll happen after I find them, but I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get to it.
Lauren narrated into the camera. As she made her way across the grassy ridge, she stumbled upon a small stream trickling down the side of the mountain. She set her gear on the ground and knelt down next to it, cupping the fresh water in her hands and washing the dried blood off her face. She looked at her reflection in the water, noticing that she was pretty bruised and cut up from her encounter with the chaser, even after being healed by the suited man. Her nose might have been broken at one point, but if so, it had been healed along with the rest of her bones. The damage could have been a lot worse, so she tried not to let it bother her, although it was still irritating to see her clothes stained by her own blood.
I just had to wear the white jacket, didn't I?
She grumbled, scooping up a few more handfuls of water and taking a much-needed drink. A few days ago, she never would have considered drinking right out of the stream, but now she barely even thought about it. Drying her hands off on her pants, she took out her phone to check the time, figuring that she still didn't have any service.
Oh, god damn it. Really?
She cursed, finding that her phone screen was riddled with cracks. She tried to turn it on, but it was to no avail.
It must have broken when the chaser attacked me.
She stuffed the phone back in her pocket with a groan of annoyance. She didn't need it to tell that it was late in the afternoon, but now she really was isolated. At least before, there had been hope that she could find some reception and call someone for help. But now she truly was on her own, and nobody would be able to contact her either.
Nothing I can do about it now. Just have to keep moving,
she told herself, pressing forward. Eventually, she found herself at the edge of a steep cliff, and she had to stop for a moment, for ahead of her was a breathtaking view. The pine forest was far below, a seemingly endless expanse of trees stretching for miles as far as the eye could see. Streams and rivers, large and small, lazily flowed through the picturesque countryside. The mountains in the distance towered over the vast landscape, the bright sunlight casting a warm golden glow upon them. The bright blue sky was clear, with only a few puffy white clouds spread across it. The birds chirped and chattered, along with the other creatures of the woods, enjoying the warmth of the sun, all while a pleasant breeze blew through the area, carrying with it some stray leaves and the smells of the forest. Lauren stood there for quite some time, awestruck at the natural beauty before her. This was one of those places that you'd never want to leave after seeing, and the lure of Alberta was tempting her to stay there forever. She pointed her camcorder at the beautiful scenery, ignoring the cracked screen and attempting to get it all on tape so she'd be able to see it again long after she'd left the area behind. It was a reprieve from the horrors surrounding her. And the more she looked at the gorgeous landscape, the more she found herself thinking of the time that she'd gone backpacking in the mountains of Virginia with her then boyfriend, the one she'd left behind in Florida.
Noah would love this view,
she muttered. She often wondered how different her life would have been if she had chosen a different path, one where she'd stayed with him, and now was no exception. She wondered if she would have ended up where she was now if she'd done things differently. Her predicament had her reevaluating a lot of things, and her old relationship was one of them.
If I make it out of this, I'm going to make things right with him,
she decided, but she realized how foolish the idea was as soon as the thought went through her head. She could never see him again, nor her family, or any of her friends back at home. for the suited man would never stop hunting her, and she couldn't risk putting them in harm's way. With that depressing thought, she finally understood how Kate had felt for all those years. Eventually, she tore her eyes away from the view and continued onwards, struggling to fight down the sadness growing inside of her. The foliage steadily grew thicker, and the ground became rockier the further she hiked along the grassy slopes. Before long, she found herself heading downhill towards a dark cave in the mountainside. She stopped for a moment, a pang of fear shooting through her as she stared into the rocky abyss, remembering the torment that she'd been put through in the mines.
No, I'm not afraid of a little cave. I've dealt with much worse,
Lauren said after a few moments of hesitation. She took a few deep breaths to calm herself down and looked back at the mesmerizing view of the landscape, doing her best to swallow her fear. Reluctantly, she flicked her flashlight on and stepped forward, shining it into the mouth of the cave. It seemed empty, but so had the Coleman mine. And as she took a few more reluctant steps, she noticed the old wooden support beams that were firmly locked in place at the entrance. She hesitantly stepped into the cave and looked around, discovering that more support beams were strategically positioned throughout it to keep it from collapsing, as if the tunnel was at least partially man-made. The further she walked, the more she believed it, as the interior of the cave wasn't much more than a path straight through to the other side of the rocky wall. She barely even needed her flashlight, as the sun shone in through the holes and cracks in the ceiling, causing small patches of grass and weeds to sprout up through the cold dirt floor. Lauren was pleasantly surprised when she was able to reach the end of the tunnel quickly and without any complications, finding that it opened up into a small grassy clearing. Just ahead stood a 2-story metal building, wedged between the stone walls of the mountain range, blocking the way. It was old, degraded, and looked like it had been abandoned for many years. She didn't know it, but this building marked the border of Oakside National Park. With no other way to go, Lauren entered the dark building through an open door, finding that it consisted of only one large room. It was cluttered with cardboard boxes, metal barrels, a few lockers, and a couple of shelves with wooden planks leaned up against them. On the other side of the room was a green dumpster that stood to the right of another door, the only other door in the building. To her dismay, that very door was secured by a rusted padlock, meaning she wasn't going anywhere unless she found a way to bust it open. The wall to the left of the door was scarred with an unnerving message. The phrase, "I want to die," was scratched all over it in a similar manner to the carvings that Lauren had seen in the Coleman mine. She had no idea who had written that there, and she didn't want to know. She was sure that she was alone in the building, and that was all that mattered to her in that moment. As she turned away from the disturbing writing, her gaze fell upon 2 desks, placed to the right of the dumpster. One of them held an old television that was hooked up to a VCR and plugged into an outlet, somehow getting power in this forgotten place. And on the other desk was something far more intriguing. Resting atop the table were 2 videotapes. One was strangely labeled, featuring a drawing of the suited man standing between 2 pine trees, and the other was labeled Matheson Farm, and was placed on top of a brown paper folder that had the word Homestead written on it. Lauren found herself gravitating towards the second tape and its accompanying folder, curious and nervous at the same time. Someone had left these tapes here for her to find. That much was obvious. But whether it had been Firebrand or the suited man remained to be seen. She couldn't deny that after so many years of hearing ominous references to the Matheson farm, the chance to finally know the truth about what happened there was exciting to her, especially if the tape held the answers to some of her own questions. Still, she needed to keep moving and find her friends. But at the same time, she had no way out of the building, and this was too good of an opportunity to pass up.
It's not like I'm going anywhere with that lock on the door. That, and these are definitely important if someone went through the trouble of leaving them here for me.
She let out a deep sigh before finally giving in to her curiosity, checking over the building one last time to make sure there weren't any nasty surprises lying in wait before shutting and locking the door behind her. On her way back to the TV, Lauren found an overturned desk chair and dragged it over with her, ready to finally get some answers. However, she decided to open the folder before watching the tape, finding that it only contained an ominous printed-out email to kmillens@bsurf.adv.co from cr119@securepost.net. Sent Saturday, 09/22/07, 2:38:47 p.m. Subject, RE. You are not going to believe this. Attachments.
Kate, I've been doing some digging and came across an old plot of land that belonged to the Masson family a ways back. Charles was known to take his wife, Diane, and his son, Charlie, to the old homestead for family picnics. I never imagined what I would see there. I think Charlie may have seen something. Something he was never meant to see. Enclosed is a recording of my findings and some documents I came across. We're dealing with something dark here, Kate. Something I can't explain. CR.
It was an understatement to say that Lauren was unnerved by what she had just read. She didn't know for sure what Carl had been implying when he said that they were dealing with something dark, but she would have bet good money on it having something to do with the suited man. More troubling was the idea that by trying to solve an old mystery, by meddling with things he shouldn't have and getting Kate involved, Carl had brought the demon into both of their lives. Lauren still wasn't sure how she was involved with everything, but if her theory was true, then Carl might have inadvertently doomed her as well. She was feeling significantly less eager to watch the footage now, but she needed to know what had really happened at the old homestead now more than ever.
Well, I wanted answers. Looks like I'm getting them whether I like it or not.
She muttered. Reluctantly, she set her equipment down on the table, inserted the tape into the VCR, hit play, and took a seat, watching nervously as the image of a country road appeared on screen. Thank you for listening to Blood and Venom, written by Arthur Faraday, under the username WoodMr13, distributed on Archive of Our Own. Season 2 of FanScape has been funded by the Nevada Arts Council and the National Endowment of the Arts. Starring Aubrey Lima as Lauren Jones and young Charlie, David Klein II as the narrator, Xander Grant as Carl Ross, guest starring Harlan Guthrie as the introduction narrator. Intro and credits music created by Dylan Griggs. Special thanks to our fellow podcasting friends who have helped make Season 2 possible. At Malevolent, Through the Fog, The Impala Films, creators of Haunted and audio drama, Woe Begone, The Morbid Forest, and our friends at World Beyond and Jabun Audio. Before we end the episode, I just want to take a moment to say that while Season 2 of FanScape was funded by a grant, future seasons will be done so out of pocket. This show has a high production cost, and any assistance you can give, be it by sharing FanScape with a friend, or by joining our Patreon or Ko-Fi, or even buying merch to help fund the show financially, would be greatly appreciated and will help make Season 3 come sooner rather than later. Links for this and everything else mentioned in the credits can be found in the description or at thefanscape.com. Thank you for listening.